Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anisha Hardy. I am the Executive Director for Alabama Values, and we are a nonpartisan grassroots communications organization that leverages culture, media, and content to raise awareness around community issues and increase civic engagement. This evening's conversation is made possible through our Down for the Count narrative initiative in partnership with Solve, HICA, and the Ordinary People Society. Now, Down for the Count is our long-term effort to demystify the census and the American Community Survey for historically undercounted communities, especially Black, Brown, rural, low-income, and immigrant populations who have too often been made invisible by systems that profit from their absence. Now, this work isn't about numbers, it is about community power, because every time we are undercounted, we are under-resourced. Our schools lose funding, our hospitals lose support, our roads, jobs, and representation suffer. And that's not an accident. And now with efforts like the SAVE Act and attacks on voting rights and redistricting, we are watching an intentional erasure of voices through policy, through narrative, and media disinformation. And so Down for the Count is our way of pushing back through community education and storytelling. And so tonight's conversation brings together some of our community partners who are fighting for representation and a fair count across the South. Together, we will unpack the stakes, uplift the stories on the ground, and we are so glad that you are here with us. So let's get into it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for the evening, Mitchell Brown, who is the Senior Counsel of the Voting Rights Section at SCSJ and the Network Coordinator for Solve. Hey, Mitch.
Hey, Anisha. Thanks so much for having me tonight.
Yes, it's all yours. I can't wait to just witness this conversation.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right.
And welcome everyone to the space. Again, my name is Mitchell Brown. I'm from the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And just wanted to give a few grounding thoughts before I jump into a little presentation that I have. The first grounding thought is we're under attack when it comes to representation. Anisha mentioned the census, and she also mentioned the redistricting processes that are happening across the country, some that have been going on for more than 5 years now. And one of the things that I think is important to note is that it all comes down to representation. If Black and Brown communities, if rural communities, if low-income communities are not represented, if those interests are not represented in the government, in electoral politics, then it truly does a disservice to those communities. And so tonight we're going to talk about the census and the potential addition of a citizenship question, which aims at counting some people and not counting others. And then we're also going to talk about how there is a movement to silence voices on the what I call the back end of representation when it comes to redistricting, because you have the census, which goes to counting people, and then you have redistricting, which is trying to discount people and their voices. And so a couple of other a few more grounding thoughts that before I jump into our conversation was that adding a citizenship question really weaponizes the census. And what we're seeing is this weaponization of the census is not something new. It's something that has been brought up before prior to the 2020 census. And it's something that the current government, current administration is trying to do again. But that weaponization of the census also is extending to voter registration forms. And with where Ryan Wagner from Black Voters Matter Fund, who I'll bring to the stage after my presentation, we'll talk about documentary proof of citizenship, or the show me your papers provisions, as she likes to call them. Those weaponizations of voter registration forms trying to, again, count certain people and discount others. But we're also seeing the weaponization of redistricting, where maps that were settled for so long are now being disrupted and redone to achieve a partisan aim, which all goes towards discounting specifically Black and Brown voters across this country in a way that elected officials are choosing their voters rather than voters choosing their representatives. And so we are supposed to be in a representative democracy, but right now that's under attack, and our ability to be represented at all levels of government is under attack. And so the first thought I have here goes to this theory of democracy. We're supposed to be a representative democracy, but we have to fix the issues with elected officials trying to destroy our representative democracy before it's too late. As I mentioned earlier, elected officials, there's this thought that elected officials should be our representatives in Congress, should be our representatives at the state legislature, should be our representatives at city councils and county commissions. And that is the form of democracy that this country was founded on. However, what we are seeing now is once elected officials get into power, they only want to stay in power, and they would do everything in their power to make sure that they choose the right voters and the right composition of their districts in order to be reelected. I've heard it said the goal of any elected official is to be reelected. And so we have to have that conversation about, to be reelected, you have to do things that are effective for our community, that represent the needs of the communities in which you serve. But what we're seeing with the addition, or the potential addition of a citizenship question, is that this country is trying to strip away representation from the people that need it the most. The laws and policies that directly affect undocumented folks, the laws and policies that represent the undercounted in our community. Like, those are the people that need the resources the most. They are the people who the laws affect the most. But when you have the government trying to take away representation and determining who counts and who doesn't based on their citizenship status, it creates an imbalance that we'll talk about in a minute. And so there's an attack on our representative democracy, and we have to fix it before it's too late. And so jumping into the census, and just as a guiding thought that I want folks to remember throughout this presentation and throughout this event tonight, is it all comes down to representation. Who is representing you? Who is representing the needs of your community? And is every vote being counted? And are all people being counted? And I bring that up in particular because there's an attack again on representation at what I call the front end, at the census level. Because when the census comes around every 10 years, there is a opportunity for people to fill out the census to be counted. And as Anisha said in her opening comments, that count leads to better resources for hospitals, for schools, better funds for roads and infrastructure in your communities. But it also goes to this thought of who's counted when it comes to redistricting. And redistricting goes to who's elected into office, and who's elected into office goes to whether or not that person is representing the needs of the community in which they are serving. And the addition of the citizenship question will cause issues with political representation because it will automatically eliminate certain people from the census data if they don't fill out the census. And this weaponization of the census is going to harm a lot of people because it's going to scare a lot of people off from filling out the census, therefore widening the gap that there already exists in filling out the census in many of our most vulnerable communities. And communities that have a lot of undocumented people are going to be undercounted. So what I mean by that is, imagine having a district that has 100 people, per the census data, has 100 people in the district, but there are 50 people within that census block that did not fill out the census. That census block really has 150 people in it, but the elected representative from that census block from that district is technically, per the redistricting maps, only representing 100 people, even though there are 150 people in that district on that census block. And to say it a different way, this literally use the word undercount, because you are undercounting people based on their failure to fill out the census because they are scared or because the resources haven't been expended to have them fill out the census. And so this addition of a citizenship question, should it go through, will severely harm these communities where there are undocumented immigrant communities and where there is a already large gap in who gets counted in the census. And so what this means ultimately is districts will be drawn with inaccurate numbers in a redistricting context, which will then potentially elevate elected officials who, one, don't know their constituencies and don't represent the needs of their constituencies because they're not counted in the census. There's already this prevailing thought that elected officials are only out there for themselves and they are only beholden to their voters. And that's something that is a conversation for another day. But in this particular context, if people are not filling out the census because they are scared of the weaponization of the census, they're scared that they may be deported, that they may lose their benefits, that their families may be harmed, and they just don't want any government interference in their lives. They just want to live their lives and do good work and continue to live the life that they've created here in this country. And having that all upended by answering a citizenship question on the census, that will scare somebody from filling out that form, and therefore undercounting in those communities. And that's really going to harm political representation. As you see from this chart, the majority of people over the last couple of years, last decade or so, this chart shows that the majority of undocumented folks come from Mexico, Central America, and South America. And what we've seen in places like Texas and Louisiana and Florida is that these immigrant communities really add to the value of these states, both economic value, but also the cultural vitality of these states in particular. And so imagine those folks being undercounted and not represented in electoral politics. It's going to cause an imbalance where you have elected officials who, again, don't know their constituency and are choosing and only represent their voters, but are really representing a large swath of communities and maybe passing laws that directly impact their constituents, either purposefully. I think a lot of it is purposeful, that those who are in power and those in office, they have a certain ideology that may not be aligned with the community that they're truly serving. And that causes an impact on the community and the vitality of their constituencies. And so adding a citizenship question is nothing new. The previous administrations tried to do it prior to the 2020 census, but the Supreme Court struck down the ability to add a citizenship question to the census. If it's brought up again, who knows what the court will do this time. But changing gears slightly, still staying on representation and why the census matters and why filling out the census matters, I want to talk about prison gerrymandering. Prison gerrymandering is the counting of incarcerated individuals where they reside in their carceral facilities rather than where they are from. To say that differently is prison gerrymandering is counting people in jail or prison, where they are in jail or prison, not where they come from. And that causes an imbalance in communities because now you have many people from communities are gone. They literally have left that community, leaving that community vulnerable to being in a district and being represented by elected officials that, again, do not value hold the same values as the community in which they're serving. And so the way the census counts folks who are incarcerated is they use census data. Again, they send the forms to the jails or prisons, and that's where folks are counted. They're counted in jail or prison, not at their last known address. And that, again, causes an imbalance because now these districts that are drawn around the prisons are artificially inflated. And I'll get to that in a minute with the picture that shows the inflation there. But it creates a power imbalance that I'll talk about in a minute. But the issue with this, and I guess the good thing about this, is that states can fix this problem. There are certain states that are listed here, such as Virginia, New York, New Jersey, Montana, etc., that they have decided to count people at their last known residence rather than at the jails or prisons. So they are taking the federal census data and fixing it for state purposes. And so there is an ability to do this, and it has been done in 14 states. And what that does is it allows districts to be drawn, when it comes down to redrawing districts, to be drawn with an accurate count of the people who live in that community. And so this idea of states not being able to do anything about it is not true. They can fix it. They just have to fix it on the state level. And we can push for the federal census to do a better job at counting people where they reside rather than in that carceral facility. But what this does is prison gerrymandering gives rural communities an outsized power, because you have a district that may have 1,000 people incarcerated in that facility, but those 1,000 people are not counted in the district. And just to give you a picture of this, imagine you have a district that has 10 people. So District A has 10 people and District B has 10 people. But District A has a jail or prison in that district. And these three individuals don't have the ability to vote because they may have felony conviction or maybe otherwise ineligible, so they're not able to vote. But they still are counted for purposes of redistricting in this district. And let me stop there for a second. The reason why they are counted in this district is this theory, this principle called one person, one vote, that a legislative body looks at the total count for that geographic area and tries to make sure that all the districts in that jurisdiction are of similar size. So I think that's an important note to make, is that these districts have to be of similar size. And so you have a district that has 10 people in it, but 3 of them can't vote. And so if a person runs for office from that district, there's only 4 people that need to elect that office in order to have a majority of the votes. Whereas in District B here, where you have, again, 10 people in that district, a person running from this district would need to have 6 votes in order to have the majority and win that election in that district. That creates a power imbalance because District A, you need less people to elect somebody to office. So that person is getting more, like that community has more power and more say in who gets elected to office. And what we know is that these districts that have these jails and prisons are usually in rural communities that don't represent the individual values of those who may be incarcerated, which is majority Black and brown voters. And so this comes to representation on the front end. But while this is happening, there's also back end attacks on representation. And what I mean by that is there are documentary proof of citizenship requirements on the voter registration forms that are being proposed via the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act or via petitions to the Election Commission here in the United States that is aimed at determining who can register to vote in this country. But there's also mid-decade redistricting and changes to the Supreme Court redistricting legal precedent. It makes it harder to challenge maps that dismantle representation of Black and brown communities. And so the first is mid-decade redistricting. So as you may have seen in the news, there are many states that are engaging in mid-decade redistricting for partisan reasons. They are receiving their marching orders from the federal government saying we need to get a certain party in power. And that causes an issue because these maps are settled. But because these legislatures in many of these states want to appease the government, they choose to redraw their districts, and the court has allowed them to do that. Like, you're allowed to redraw maps given for partisan reasons. And so what this does is it attacks representation because now districts are being gerrymandered and changed, where you have elected officials representing communities or supposed to represent communities that they don't share values with. And it's really causing an issue. But a bigger issue that's tied to the census is that these maps are being drawn with old 2020 data. And the reason why these maps are being drawn with old data is because in many of these states, the legislation, the law says you have to draw districts based on the decennial census. That means on the 20s, like 2010, 2020, 2030, like you have to use the data at the time that the census was taken. You can't use the data now in many states. And so these legislatures are drawing districts based off of faulty data. And so this goes to this theory of you are trying to attack representation, but you're doing it with faulty data, and you're doing it purposely to disenfranchise specifically Black and brown communities. And so this causes, again, a power imbalance in communities because you have elected officials who are choosing their voters. Voters aren't choosing their elected officials in many of these states. And it happens throughout the country. It mainly happening in the South right now, but it's happening throughout this country in this tit-for-tat redistricting amongst the political parties in this country. But one thing that I want to drive home, and I think people need to understand about representation, is that we have avenues to challenge these maps that I'll talk about in a minute. But these maps are based on projections, not realities. And what I mean by that is when a legislature draws a map, they're looking at the results of an election that may have happened years before the maps are drawn, and saying that this district is going to go a certain way, is going to vote a certain way. But that is based off of sometimes low voter turnout. Voter turnout is usually for presidential elections maybe between 50 and 60% in most states. Imagine if we had 80% voter turnout. Imagine if we had just 5 to 10% more voter turnout in some of these jurisdictions. That could flip these districts on its head and change the outcome of some of these districts. Because again, these maps are based off projections of what a future action will be, rather than the reality of what that action actually is. And so if we are able to turn out to vote and able to continue to push voters to the polls, it could change the outcome of some of these elections. And the last thing before I bring Lady and Ryan to the stage is I just want to mention the changing redistricting precedent that is going to make it harder to challenge redistricting maps, which means it's going to be harder to challenge the lack of representation for Black and brown communities in this country. There's 3 cases that I want to mention. The first is Louisiana versus Calais, and that goes to whether or not a state can use racial data to redraw districts after a state has already been found to have racially discriminated against voters. So basically, can you use race to solve a racial discrimination issue? And the answer is yes. You should be able to use racial considerations in order to fix a racial discriminatory issue, but the court may decide otherwise. The second case goes to racial gerrymandering, and in that case is Alexander versus the South Carolina State Conference of the NAACP. The state legislature moved 30,000 Black voters from one district to another, allegedly because they were Democrats, not because they were Black. But the evidence in that case showed that they moved these voters because they were Black, because they had a racial quota to hit. But the Supreme Court found that because they did it for partisan reasons and they believed the South Carolina legislature, there was no racial gerrymandering in that case. And the last case goes to whether or not the Department of Justice can be the only entity to challenge maps under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the NAACP versus Arkansas Board of Apportionment. And you may be asking, what does this have to do with redistricting and with the census and with representation? And the answer is that it goes to representation because the census and the changes to the census are going to affect voters on the front end, but redistricting and the changing of districts to change the representation for communities across the South and across this country is going to also affect representation. So we have a front end, back end problem that we have to address. And if we don't address it quickly, it's going to cause a lot of issues. But I wanted to bring to the stage Lady Carlson from the West Side Sponsoring Committee and Ryan Wagner from Black Voters Matter Fund to talk a little bit about what's happening on the ground. So Lady's going to talk about what's happening on the ground in Louisiana with respect to Calais, any census organizing happening there. And Ryan's going to be talking about the Show Me Your Papers provisions that are running so rampant in this country that are affecting voter registration. And Lady, turning to you first. My first question is, what concerns you about the outcome of the Calais case? And then what are folks on the ground feeling about potentially losing Black representation in Louisiana?
Louisiana has the dubious distinction of giving the country separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson. And now it seems we'll have the dubious distinction of ending the voting or greatly weakening the Voting Rights Act. The 6 of the plaintiffs were leaders from our organization, the single plaintiffs. Dr. Press Robinson was the lead plaintiff, the first Black elected school board member in East Baton Rouge. And as you can tell, our leaders are hoping for the best, but based on the questioning of the judges, we're not sure. And the leaders that were the plaintiffs are in their 60s or 70s. They fought this fight as young people, and now they're still fighting it. And I don't think we're discouraged. I just think we understand we have to keep fighting and keep going even if the decision does not go our way.
And so are there conversations on the ground about getting accurate census numbers and making sure people are filling out the census for the next redistricting process? Have y'all moved on to the next redistricting process, or are you still holding out hope that we'll have a good outcome in the Calais case?
I think both and. We are one of our areas in Louisiana, because people did not fill out the census, lost a school board representative. And so we're still talking about it's important to do the census, to fill it out accurately so that we can be represented fairly. And so it is an ongoing conversation that we're having. We don't think it ends because it's not here now. We have to keep educating our folks about the importance of filling it out.
Yeah. And so just tied with that, the importance of filling it out are folks gearing up, getting out to vote for people? Are you all pushing to get people out to vote to kind of challenge whatever changes are made in the districts, that if you get out to vote, you still can have an effect on the local and state level, potentially, but maybe even federal if it's a high enough voter turnout? Are you pushing out to vote to really focus on local issues?
It's important to vote in elections, even if it's for dog catcher. We're doing voter education that, again, your vote does count. And look at what we were able to do because we rallied and we voted. And so, again, it's a year round. We've decided you just can't talk about getting out the vote in October for the November election. You have to talk about it all the time. And we're developing tools to show people where we won, how important their vote was in winning those victories.
And just to add on to your statements, lady, I think it's important for people to realize that civic engagement has to be year round. I wanted to plus one that it has to be year round. And one of the things that at SCSJ that we've been talking about a lot is focusing on local elections. Again, as I stated in my presentation, it's not a foregone conclusion that these maps are going to turn out the way that they are drawing these maps, because if we get out to vote, we're able to potentially change the outcome of these districts. But at the local level, when you may have a couple thousand people voting in a municipal election, that we love to have more, but when races are decided by smaller margins, getting out to vote and challenging local elected officials really has an impact on the local representation. And so last question for you, lady, before I turn it over to Ryan, is do you think that Black Louisianans have been adequately represented in the legislature and in Congress?
No. No.
Why not?
So before we got the second Black congressional district, we were represented by a white congressman. He never talked to his constituents. He only talked to the people that he agreed with. He did not talk to people that he felt did not have his same interest at heart. We have one of the Congress people is in Monroe, but she represents an area down in Baton Rouge. She visits with the farmers. We are not farmers. We are. And when we request meetings with any of our delegation, except for our Black Congress people, we get their aides and they don't meet with us. The second thing is our state legislature is getting less and less responsive to the African American and minority voters. And our minority representation is shrinking more and more. And so we feel like we have to keep fighting because that's the only way we get our voices heard, both locally, but also nationally.
All right. Thank you so much, lady. And Ryan, I'm gonna turn it over to you. So lady talked about what I consider the back end of representation, about redistricting and why attacks on redistricting and attacks on who represents communities matters. But I want to switch back to the front end and talk about citizenship questions and the SAVE Act and how that's going to impact who's counted and who's able to register to vote in this country. And so tell us a little bit about the SAVE Act and what it is and what the potential harms are.
So the SAVE Act, as I affectionately call the Show Me Your Papers Act, is a way to not only disenfranchise millions of voters, but it also seeks to target our undocumented folks, right? Because on its face, for example, the Real ID Act that was passed in 2005 does not explicitly mean that your new Real ID for the states that follow suit fairly quickly after it was passed, it does not indicate citizenship. And so there's a real push to try and change that. as you've already talked about, they're trying to reintroduce the citizenship question onto the census itself. There have been a concerted effort to undermine through litigation the 2020 census. And my God, who wants to carry around their marriage license identifying who they are? Just that portion of it alone would impact at least 69 million women, because married people, because particularly women, we change our names. Not all of us. We change our names when we get married. And to have the audacity to try and make my new last name match my birth certificate, the math ain't mathing, right? And more statistics, right? It's more people with driver's license than passports. But then when you break that down by socioeconomic factors, age, race, what have you, that drops even lower for Black and Brown communities. So while 51% of the population may have a passport, and 90+%, which give or take, 90% is real high, may have a driver's license. When you break that down by demographics, you can see where that voter suppression would really impact Black and Brown communities. Because as it stands right now, 24% of voting age Latino and Latinas are without a driver's license. 21% with Black Americans versus a 8%, give or take, for white Americans in the country. And then when you get to the passport piece of that, it really shines through who has and who doesn't have one. One is cost prohibitive, right? So to require somebody, say I have a military ID or tribal ID, I would need additional documentary proof to not only prove who I am, but to also to go vote. And we know how wildly different each state is about what they require on top of the real ID requirements now, which it's up for debate whether or not that was rolled out in a organized fashion. So it's a lot of factors. Because Congress is stalled in Congress, there's been this concerted effort to revisit through executive action, attacking the vote by mail structure. Our cybersecurity apparatus funding is virtually non-existent. And so there's so many layers to this conversation. So it's imperative that we not only educate people in advance, we're a year out from a midterm election. Vote Riders is one of the groups that is really helping folks with driver's license access. We got our formerly incarcerated folks who we're really working hard to make sure they have ID to even vote, let alone drive. So it's an interesting thing to try and make people have, to not only try and target folks who are undocumented, but also it feels like a mechanism to track people because people move around a lot, which is why the census is so important, because we need to be able to account for the folks that have moved out of state, moved other places, moved addresses locally, so that they get the resources that they need in community. This goes way beyond racial vote dilution, right? This is about resources for schools, hospitals, all the things folks need that affect their day-to-day lives as we navigate challenging political landscapes.
Yeah. And so what it seems to me, and thanks for sharing your thoughts, is that there is this, again, attack on representation and trying to diminish the electorate and trying to winnow down the electorate to only have certain people within the electorate who will vote a certain way. And so, like, we see these attacks with voter ID. You mentioned voter ID, the documentary proof of citizenship requirements. I think it's going to backfire on a lot of folks because it's going to swallow up a lot more folks who just don't have access to documents in order to register to vote. And just on that point, to raise why the documents are important, and Ryan mentioned the marriage license, is that your name has to match, your name of your voter registration has to match your current name. So if you changed it, it's going to cause an issue. So tied with that, you mentioned the census and seeing where people have moved. There's the addition of the citizenship question on the census, or potential addition. Do you think that addition to the census and then the SAVE Act go hand in hand, or is there any connection between the two?
If it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a duck.
Yeah.
And that proof is in the pudding in this executive action push to bring back that specific portion of the Show Me Your Papers Act. And I will say, after so much after advocating for people to provide public comment on the pro-democracy side, we were able to really catch up I'm competitive. I never want to lose something like that, especially when it comes to voting rights, and people need to know what's happening so they're not surprised. But I will say the Election Assistance Commission will decide on the merits of the petition at all to do this, but they're inextricably connected. We got to tell the truth and shame the devil. Right. So it's very important that we're connecting the dots with folks, but also being proactive, making sure folks know what the rules are in terms of ID ahead of time for their various states, because it's different everywhere. Some states have stricter voter ID laws than others. So the onus is on us and community to make sure people are prepared with the proper ID, and like reminding folks when you move, make sure you update. That again, like not everybody's doing the U.S. Postal Service change of address. Some of us just move and then we try and figure out the rest later, updating our driver's license. And that takes a while to get all your paperwork updated to reflect where you currently move. And so that makes it even more important for the census work to happen, especially folks with school-age kids, to make sure they're in school districts that are adequately funded and so forth.
Yeah. And so what I'm going to do, Ryan, I'm going to ask you a question about why representation matters. And lady, I'm going to ask you the same question, and then I'll share some closing thoughts. But Ryan, to you, like, why does representation matter? And what I mean by that is, again, there are attacks by the government, by legislatures, on who can represent, like who is represented in government, what communities are represented in government, what values are represented in government. Why does who represents us matter? Like, why does that representation really matter to the uplift of our communities?
At minimum, it's about our voice. If we are not at the table, we're on the menu. And I would also argue, going beyond just representation, right? Making sure we have people in elected office at every level of government, because all voting is local, right? That are there on behalf of us and not the other way around. You're seeing electeds pick their voters through this mid-year gerrymandering that's happening across the country. And that usually is a sign that they know they're doing wrong, right? If the public is not, in fact, happy with what's going on, then 9 times out of 10, here we are. That's why representation is so important. And even as a Black woman, as much as I want to see myself represented, because we're doing a poor job in the Senate with Black female representation, I also want somebody that is in alignment with my values and the issues I care about.
Yep. And lady, let me turn it to you. Like, why does representation matter to you? And so you talked about Calais and the potential loss of Black representation in Louisiana. But generally, like, why is it important for there to be representation that represents the values that your community holds?
My grandmother taught me your vote is your voice, and that we needed to elect people. And unfortunately, my grandmother never got a chance to vote because she couldn't pass a literacy test. We need people from our communities that understand our communities. The disinvestment in inner cities is really because we don't have people listening to what the inner city needs, what New Orleans or Baton Rouge or Black rural communities need. And that if we don't have people that understand our interests, our stories, our struggles, then we don't have people that are voting or are representing us in a way that can address the issues and the concerns that we have and that we've had over the years. And so we need people that are going to come and sit down with us and say, in the living room, tell what's happening in this neighborhood and what's going on and how should I be thinking about this neighborhood and voting in a way that addresses the concerns you're raising. And that's not happening. It is just flat not happening with the bulk of people that are elected officials today.
All right. Thank you so much, Ryan and lady, for your time today. Before we head out, I would love to share a few closing thoughts with the audience around this idea of representation and this idea of who is being counted. And so again, thank you so much, Ryan and lady, for your time. And so just wanted to share a few closing thoughts about representation. So you heard from Lady and from Ryan about why representation matters. And the title of this program is, this campaign is Down for the Count. And it really is centered on being counted in the census, being counted in the American Community Surveys. But I would extend it slightly. If Alabama Values will allow me, I extend it just slightly to let your voice be counted as well in your legislature, in your city councils, in your local school boards. And I want to end with this story. So part of my role at SCSJ is being senior counsel and giving election advice and voting rights advocacy advice to community groups. I recently was working with a community in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, where the school board had to redraw its districts after a lengthy time of the county being under a consent decree to give black students an adequate education in Edgecombe and Nash County. And because of this annexation, because of this consent decree in Edgecombe County, the school board had to redraw its districts and had to make sure that the districts were going to represent the black community. And working with that local community, we were able to bring out over 200 people to community hearings and that the school board had to talk about why they wanted to be counted in the number when it came to redistricting, why it mattered that their voices mattered in the school board for their kids, for themselves. They wanted to be adequately represented. And so that to me showed the power of local community. And if we come together, what we are able to do to be counted in our government. And so right now there are many plans, many plots afoot to diminish our representation as Black and brown communities in our local government, in our state government, in the federal government. And so we have to continue to push people to get out to vote, push them to get involved with their own civic engagement, to tell their neighbors about the importance of voting and the importance of filling out the census and the ACS, because this is where our resources come from. This is how our voices are heard. And we have to, in my opinion, start locally, and hopefully that will bubble up to the state and federal level to really, truly make a change. We have to be represented in our halls of government. But right now, we aren't doing that, and so we have to fight back. And so with that, I bid you a good night, and thank you so much for your time this evening.